Science and academia are supposed to be progressive. The idea of developing knowledge and pushing the boundary of knowledge is, in the end, a means towards an end of moving our society forward. Um, Recent events surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement and racial tensions in the United States have shown that we still have a lot of growing to do as a society. And unfortunately, science and academia are not immune to that growing. There is a lot of systemic discrimination within academia that causes a lot of problems for people of color and other minorities that should be addressed going forward. And people like me who have this platform should be discussing these issues, at least in terms of academia and science. And I personally, from what I've researched, think that it comes down to an issue of perception. An issue that exists at all levels of academia, starting from primary school, elementary school. Black and other minority students, when they're kids, they don't perceive themselves as future scientists, and they don't perceive science as something for them. A study performed in the UK found that there's no lack of aspirations for these students. They, more often than not, students who are Black and Latino and other minorities like that had just as much of an interest in pursuing and becoming a scientist as white and Asian students. However, as they kind of grew up, they just saw that there weren't people like them in science, and they kind of lose that aspiration, combined with their teachers' perceptions of them. Often teachers in primary and secondary school, when they even if they're not actively doing it, they have discriminations. They see lower income students and they don't put as much effort into them because they don't think they're as likely to succeed. And statistically, more often than not, these students who are from these minorities are interested in pursuing careers in science to better their communities more often than white or Asian students who are doing it because it's an aspiration. That's why I pursued science. It wasn't, as a kid, it wasn't some desire to better society, though that's more how I feel now. But as a kid, it was something that I wanted to do because of the romantic notion of science. But more often than not, Black and Latino students in primary and secondary education, they want to better their society, they want to better their community, and they see science as a potential avenue. But by the time they get to their secondary education, they've just been pushed away from it, whether by a lack of success in math and science due to a lack of help from their teachers, or just the perception that it's not for them. And then if a Black student does make it to college as a STEM major, they've pushed through that discrimination. They're now faced with new discrimination. They're faced with the challenge of being in these difficult programs without necessarily having the preparation from their secondary education to succeed in those programs. That, combined with the fact that they're often very competitive and they're most likely faced with discrimination from their peers who are white or other races who are more likely to move into those programs, and it creates a second level of systemic issues with pursuing these fields. That, combined with the fact that, again, there's still not very many role models. Statistically, Black and Latino students are the most likely to switch from a STEM major to a non-STEM major in colleges across the United States. And that is very unfortunate. Now, let's say a student pushes through all of that and they go to grad school and they end up in academia and they end up a scientist or an academic. They're now faced with a whole slew of problems. Academia is hard. It's hard to make a living in it. You have to work incredibly hard. You have to commit yourself. You have to push yourself, and you have to decide what kind of academic you're going to be. Are you going to be the kind that just kind of skates by on your research laurels, or are you going to be the kind to commit yourself to everything you can? And that ends up really piling up. That ends up really weighing on you. That puts a lot of work on your shoulders. And more often than not, women and minorities in fields like this, they're often put in a position where they feel like they need to prove themselves due to that discrimination within the field. And that ends up resulting in them putting more work on themselves than anybody else, and putting more pressure on themselves than anybody else in order to succeed, even though they're just as capable as everyone else. One example of this is, I will link an article in the description of this, of a Black professor who says that him and many other people in his position feel that they need to serve as a mentor and a role model to every Black student that comes through their classes. That's a lot. That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself when you're a young scientist trying to develop your career, trying to be successful, trying to do your research, trying to get on committees, trying to prove yourself as a scientist. To have that added pressure and to feel like you have to do it is a lot. And it's really good that they are doing it, but it's still a lot of work. Now, I presented a lot of issues here. Much of it might be emotionally fueled, and that's okay, because that might be what's needed. But I've also presented you with the facts. And in the description, I'm going to post a number of articles, both news articles and studies that have discussed these issues in academia relating to race and other and women issues as well. And the question becomes, what can everybody do to kind of fix these issues? And it starts young. Teachers in primary and secondary education, you need to think about putting the same level of effort into all your students and encouraging all your students to pursue the fields that they want to pursue, no matter their economic background. Some students may just not be cut out, but that's not a race issue and that's not an economic issue. That's just a personal issue. Everybody needs to have this same starting foothold. As far as parents need to do the same thing. They need to be able to encourage their students to their children to pursue these things if there's something that they want to do. We need to change the perception that academia and STEM is for everybody. At the college level, there needs to be a change in perception, I think, in general, of the competitiveness. Science should be collaboratory, and the idea that even in college, these students are constantly competing with each other to be the best doesn't necessarily breed the best environment. And that will benefit both minorities and non-minorities, but it's important that we come at that with a focus on making this an inclusive environment for everybody. And that also includes college admissions. I forgot to mention that before, but there's a study that I will link in the description of a number of admissions committees were presented with applications for their program. Believe it was a physics program. And the only thing that was different on all the applications was the names. And the names were representative of particular races. And there was discrimination based entirely on names. Professors admitted that they were more likely to accept white males than they were to accept any of the other applications. We need to be more equivalent in our admissions processes. And then at the highest levels of academia, there needs to be a removal of this pressure to always be pushing at every direction. Scientists need to be able to do their science without feeling like they need to commit themselves to every other avenue. And that's a tricky thing to do, because there is systemic discrimination at that level, which is what pushes these minority academics to do that. And because it is important that younger people of color have these role models and these mentors as they're going through their process of becoming scientists. So that is an issue that I personally do not have a suggested answer for. But it is an issue that needs to be solved. We are at a difficult time in our society, and academia needs to stand as a sort of beacon of progressive nature. We need to academia cannot be political. It needs to be something that is inclusive and open in order to push ourselves forward as a society. That is at least what I think. As I said, there are going to be a number of links to articles in the description that will be able to explain all this a lot better than I can. So please take a look at all of those. And this has been the Ivory Elevator. First video in a while.